The air in the colonel's study hung thick with the cloying sweetness of decayed magnolias and something far more sinister, the metallic tang of blood barely masked by expensive cigar smoke. Moonlight, cold and unforgiving, sliced through the tall, leaded windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing like agitated spirits above the mahogany desk. On that desk, slick with a dark, viscous stain that would never fully wash out, lay a single sheet of parchment. Its edges were crisp, its ink a deep, accusing black, but the words it bore were a blasphemy against God, nature, and the very foundation of the Southern aristocracy Colonel Alastair Thorne had spent his life defending. His hand, usually so steady when signing orders that sent men to their deaths, trembled as he pressed his signet ring into the soft wax seal. The imprint was the proud Thorne crest, a rampant lion, but in that moment, it looked less like a symbol of nobility and more like the mark of a beast cornered, a predator who had just signed away his own soul. Outside, the cicadas had fallen silent. The only sound was the frantic hammering of his own heart and the soft, rhythmic shuffle of 7 pairs of bare feet on the gravel path leading to his front door. They were coming. The agreement was sealed, and with it, the gilded dynasty of Oakhaven Plantation, a legacy built on blood, cotton, and the unshakable belief in white supremacy, was already crumbling into dust. He had given them his wife, not as a hostage, not as a bargaining chip in some crude transaction, but as a possession, a thing, a reward. And in that single, unspeakable act of surrender, Alastair Thorne had not just betrayed his wife, Eleanor. He had signed the death warrant for everything his family had ever been. The story of Oakhaven and the Thorne dynasty begins not in the suffocating heat of a Georgia summer, but decades earlier, in the frostbitten ambition of a man named Silas Thorne. Silas was no gentleman planter. He was a scavenger, a speculator, a man who smelled opportunity in the chaos of a young nation tearing itself apart over the very soil it was built upon. He arrived in the Georgia backcountry in 1798 with nothing but a worn saddlebag, a flintlock pistol, and a mind as sharp and ruthless as a butcher's cleaver. He saw not wilderness but potential. He saw not swampland, but future fields of white gold. Through a combination of shrewd land grabs, predatory lending to desperate farmers, and a chilling indifference to the human cost, Silas amassed a sprawling tract of land he christened Oakhaven. His fortune was built on the backs of the first enslaved people he purchased, a family of 4, torn from a Virginia plantation. Their names were forgotten in the Thorne ledgers, recorded only as prime male, breeding female, and too young. Silas Thorne didn't believe in names for his property. He believed in inventory. His son, Percival, inherited not just the land and the slaves, but the cold, calculating heart of his father. Percival was the architect of the Oakhaven dynasty's public face. He built the grand Greek revival mansion that still stood, a monument to ill-gotten gains disguised as Southern gentility. He hosted lavish parties where the cream of Savannah society sipped mint juleps on the veranda, their laughter mingling with the distant, rhythmic thud of hoes in the cotton fields. Percival understood the power of image. He cultivated the persona of the benevolent patriarch, the noble planter who cared for his people as a father would his children. It was a lie as vast and deep as the Savannah River, but it was a necessary one. It allowed the Thornes to move in circles of power, to influence state politics, to ensure their wealth and privilege remained unchallenged. The reality behind the manicured lawns and the sweet scent of jasmine was a regime of terror. Overseers ruled with whips and chains, and any hint of resistance was met with brutal, public punishment designed to crush the spirit as much as the body. The Thorne fortune, glittering and immense, was soaked in the sweat and blood of generations. It was into this world of gilded cages and hidden horrors that Alastair Thorne was born in 1825. He was the 3rd son and by all rights should have been a footnote in the family history, destined for a life as a minor functionary on the estate or perhaps a career in the clergy. But fate, or perhaps the cruel hand of his father, intervened. His 2 elder brothers, Charles and Edmund, were killed in a single, senseless duel over a disputed card game in New Orleans. Overnight, Alastair, a quiet, bookish boy with a penchant for military history and a deep-seated insecurity about his place in the world, became the heir to Oakhaven. The weight of the dynasty settled on his narrow shoulders, and it was a burden he was determined to bear with the same iron will as his forebears. Alistair was sent to West Point, not for a love of soldiering, but because it was expected of a Southern gentleman of his standing. He graduated not with honors, but with a commission and a rigid, almost fanatical belief in order, discipline, and the absolute right of his class to rule. He returned to Oakhaven a changed man. The bookish boy was gone, replaced by Colonel Alistair Thorne, a man whose uniform was a second skin and whose authority was as unquestionable as the sunrise. He ran Oakhaven with military precision. The fields were his battalions, the slaves his conscripted army, and his word was law. He married Eleanor Winthrop, the daughter of a Charleston shipping magnate, in a union that was less about love and more about consolidating wealth and social standing. Eleanor was beautiful, with raven-black hair and eyes the color of storm clouds, but she was also intelligent and, in her quiet way, observant. She saw the cracks in the colonel's armor, the flicker of doubt that sometimes crossed his face when he thought no one was looking. She saw the fear that lived beneath his bluster, a fear of failing the legacy he had been handed. For years, the system held. The cotton flowed, the money piled up, and the colonel's reputation as a pillar of the community grew. But the world outside Oakhaven was changing. The rumblings of abolition grew louder, a distant thunder that the colonel dismissed as the noise of northern fanatics. He believed the South was invincible, its way of life ordained by God and protected by the valor of men like him. He poured his energy into preparing for a conflict he was certain would come, drilling a private militia of loyal overseers and poor white neighbors, stockpiling weapons in the old root cellar beneath the mansion. He saw himself as a bulwark against chaos, the last defender of a sacred order. Then, in the spring of 1860, the first true tremor of that coming storm reached Oakhaven. It wasn't a political speech or a newspaper editorial. It was a whisper, a rumor that slithered through the slave quarters like a venomous snake. A whisper of a man named Nat Turner, of Denmark Vesey, of rebellions that had been crushed but whose embers still glowed. At Oakhaven, the whisper took a more personal, more terrifying form. It centered on a man named Kofi. Kofi was not a field hand. He was a house slave, a butler, a man who had served the Thorne family for over 20 years. He was known for his quiet dignity, his impeccable service, and his unnerving stillness. He moved through the mansion like a ghost, his eyes missing nothing. The colonel trusted him implicitly, or at least as much as he could trust any black man. Kofi was the one who brought his morning coffee, who polished his boots, who stood silently in the corner during his strategy sessions with his militia captains. But Kofi had a secret he had guarded for his entire life. He was not just a butler, he was a leader of a network of enslaved people who had been quietly, patiently building a plan. They had been watching the colonel's preparations, noting the location of the armory, the routines of the overseers, the weaknesses in the plantation's defenses. They had been listening to the whispers from the north, and they had decided that their time for waiting was over. The coming war, they reasoned, was their opportunity. While the white men were distracted by their grand conflict, the enslaved could seize their own freedom. And Kofi, with his access to the heart of the Thorne household, was their key. The first sign that something was terribly wrong was the silence. One morning, the usual chorus of birdsong was absent. The colonel, a man attuned to the rhythms of his estate, felt a prickle of unease as he walked to his study. His coffee was late. He rang the bell for Kofi, but no one came. He went to the kitchen and found it empty, the stove cold. A cold dread, colder than any he had felt on the parade ground, began to coil in his gut. He stepped onto the veranda, and his blood ran cold. The fields were empty. Not a single soul was working. The entire enslaved population of Oakhaven, over 200 souls, had vanished in the night. Panic, raw and primal, seized him. He rallied his militia, a ragged band of 20 men, their faces pale with fear. They scoured the plantation, searching the woods, the swamps, the outbuildings. They found nothing but abandoned shacks and the eerie silence. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole. For 3 days, the colonel lived in a state of high alert, jumping at every shadow, his nerves frayed to breaking point. He knew they were out there, watching, waiting. He knew this was not a flight to freedom. This was a siege. They were not running away. They were preparing to come back. On the 4th night, the siege began. It started with fire. A barn on the eastern edge of the property erupted in flames, the orange light painting the night sky in hellish colors. Then another, and another. The militia, panicked and disorganized, rushed to fight the blazes, only to be picked off by sharpshooters hidden in the treeline. Arrows, crude but deadly, flew from the darkness, finding their marks with terrifying accuracy. The colonel, barking orders from the mansion's portico, felt his world shrinking, his control slipping away. His militia, his pride and his protection, was being whittled down, their courage evaporating in the face of an enemy they could not see. By dawn, the militia was broken. 10 men were dead, their bodies left as a grim message on the main drive. The rest had fled into the woods, abandoning the colonel to his fate. He was alone in the great house, the symbol of his power, now his prison. He barricaded the doors, loaded his dueling pistols, and waited. He knew they would come for him. He expected death. He braced himself for the final, violent end of the Thorn dynasty. But what came was far worse than death. At midday, a single figure emerged from the tree line. It was Kofi. He walked slowly, deliberately, his hands empty, his face a mask of calm. He stopped at the foot of the mansion's grand staircase and looked up at the colonel, who stood at a second-floor window, pistol in hand. "Colonel Thorn." Kofi's voice was clear, calm, and carried an authority the colonel had never heard from him before. "We have a proposition." The colonel's finger tightened on the trigger. "I have no propositions for traitors and murderers," he snarled, his voice cracking with fear and rage. Kofi did not flinch. "This is not a request, Colonel. It is a choice between your life and your legacy." The colonel laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "My legacy is already ash. You've seen to that." "Not yet," Kofi said, his eyes never leaving the colonel's. "Your legacy is your bloodline, your wife, your unborn child." The colonel's blood turned to ice. Eleanor was in her 3rd month of pregnancy. He had told no one but the family physician. How could Kofi know? The violation was absolute. They had been inside his home, listening to his most private conversations. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming. "What do you want?" the colonel whispered, the fight draining out of him. "We want Oakhaven," Kofi said simply. "All of it. The land, the house, the stores. We want it as our own. But we know the world will not allow that. Not yet. So we will take what we can. We will take your wealth, your weapons, your livestock, and we will take a guarantee of your silence." "My silence?" The colonel's mind raced. "What guarantee?" Kofi's gaze was steady, unblinking. "Your wife, Eleanor. She will come with us. She will be ours. A symbol of your surrender. A living pledge that you will not pursue us, that you will not call the law down upon us. If you break this agreement, if you speak a word of this to anyone, she will die. And your child with her." The colonel felt the world tilt on its axis. The request was so monstrous, so beyond the pale of human comprehension, that for a moment he thought he was hallucinating. Give his wife to them. To be what? A slave? A concubine? The very thought was a physical blow. He saw Eleanor's face in his mind, her storm-gray eyes wide with terror. He saw the tiny life growing inside her, a Thorn heir, the last hope of the dynasty. To sacrifice them both was unthinkable. And yet, what choice did he have? He was alone, unarmed, helpless. To refuse was to condemn them to a slow, torturous death at the hands of men he had brutalized for his entire life. His mind, trained for strategy, for cold calculation, began to work. Was this a bluff? Could he stall? Could he find a way to outmaneuver them? He looked down at Kofi, at the calm certainty in his eyes, and knew it was no bluff. These men had planned this for months, perhaps years. They had studied him, his weaknesses, his pride. They knew he would choose the survival of his bloodline over his own honor. They knew he was a coward at heart, a man who would sacrifice anything, even his wife, to preserve the illusion of his legacy. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The colonel's knuckles were white on the windowsill. He thought of his father, Percival, who would have died before submitting to such a demand. He thought of his grandfather, Silas, who would have burned the plantation to the ground rather than let it fall into black hands. And he knew, with a sickening certainty, that he was not made of the same stuff. He was a man of his time, a man of his class, but he was also a man who feared death more than dishonor. 7 days, the colonel said, his voice hoarse. I need 7 days to prepare her, to explain. Kofi shook his head. No, you have until sunset. We will be waiting at the edge of the north pasture. If she is not there, we will come for her. And we will not be so polite. The finality in Kofi's voice left no room for negotiation. The colonel watched as the butler turned and walked back into the woods, his figure disappearing into the green gloom. The colonel slumped against the wall, his legs giving way. He was defeated, not by an army, but by a handful of men he had considered less than human. And the price of his defeat was his wife. He found Eleanor in the music room, her fingers idly tracing the keys of the grand piano. She looked up as he entered, her face pale but composed. She had heard the commotion, the screams in the night, the crackle of the fires. She knew something terrible had happened. Alistair? She asked, her voice trembling. What is it? Where is everyone? He couldn't meet her eyes. He walked to the window, staring out at the smoldering ruins of his barns. How could he tell her? How could he say the words? Eleanor, he began, his voice thick with shame. There has been an uprising. The slaves, they've taken control of the plantation. Her hand flew to her mouth. Oh God, are you hurt? The baby. I'm fine, he said quickly. But they've made a demand. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and a desperate, pleading hope that she would understand, that she would forgive him. They want you, Eleanor. They want you to go with them, as a guarantee of my silence. The color drained from her face. She stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief, then dawning horror. You would give me to them? To those men? It's the only way, he cried, his voice rising in panic. Don't you see? If I refuse, they'll kill us both. They'll kill the child. This is the only chance we have to survive. Survive, she whispered, her voice cracking. What kind of survival is that? To live knowing you traded me away like a piece of livestock? To live with the shame of it? She stood up, her small frame trembling with fury. I would rather die, Alistair. I would rather they cut my throat than be your bargaining chip. He grabbed her arms, his grip tight, almost painful. You don't understand. This is bigger than you. This is about the Thorn name, about our child's future. If I can keep you alive, if I can keep the bloodline going, then Oakhaven can be rebuilt. The dynasty can survive. The dynasty? She spat, wrenching herself free. The dynasty is built on lies and blood, Alistair. And now you want to add my body to its foundation? No, I won't do it. He saw the resolve in her eyes, the steel beneath her fear. He knew she meant it, and in that moment, his own resolve hardened into something cold and terrible. He couldn't let her refuse. He couldn't let his last chance slip away. He was the colonel. He was in command. He would make her obey. He called for the one person he knew he could still trust. Mrs. Gable, the elderly housekeeper who had been with the family since his childhood. She was white, loyal, and terrified of the rebels. He told her a half-truth, that Eleanor was in danger and needed to be taken to safety, to a hidden location in the woods where a rescue party would find her. Mrs. Gable, her face etched with worry, agreed without question. That afternoon, under the colonel's watchful eye, Mrs. Gable helped Eleanor into a simple traveling dress. Eleanor's eyes were red-rimmed, her face a mask of numb resignation. She knew she was being betrayed, but she also knew she was powerless. She was a woman in a man's world, and her husband's word was law. As they led her out of the house, she turned back to look at Alistair one last time. There was no love in her eyes, no forgiveness, only a profound, soul-crushing disappointment. It was a look that would haunt him for the rest of his days. They walked her to the edge of the north pasture, where the tree line began. 7 figures stood waiting in the shadows. Kofi was at their head. The others were men the colonel recognized. Field hands, blacksmiths, men he had whipped and cursed and treated as less than dirt. Now they stood tall, their eyes fixed on Eleanor with a mixture of grim purpose and something else. Something that made the colonel's stomach churn. Mrs. Gable, her duty done, hurried back to the house, casting fearful glances over her shoulder. The colonel watched from a distance, hidden behind a copse of oaks, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw Kofi step forward and take Eleanor's arm. She didn't resist. She just walked with them, her head held high, disappearing into the dark embrace of the forest. The colonel sank to his knees, the weight of his betrayal crushing him. He had saved his bloodline, he told himself. He had preserved the Thorn name. But as he looked at the empty space where his wife had stood, he knew he had lost everything that mattered. The days that followed were a blur of numb horror. The colonel was a ghost in his own home. He wandered the empty halls, the silence a constant, accusing presence. He tried to convince himself that Eleanor was alive, that she was being kept safe, that the rebels would honor their agreement. But the doubt was a cancer eating away at him. He imagined the worst, the degradation, the violence, the slow death of her spirit. He imagined his unborn child, a Thorn heir, growing up in captivity, a bastard of the rebellion. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He received his first message a week later. It was a small, folded piece of paper, left on the doorstep. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. She lives. Keep silent. There was no signature, but he knew it was from Kofi. The relief was immediate, but it was quickly followed by a fresh wave of shame. He was being managed, controlled by the very men he had once owned. He was a puppet and they held the strings. Months passed. The civil war erupted, tearing the nation apart. The world outside Oakhaven descended into chaos, but the colonel was trapped in his own private hell. He heard rumors of Union troops marching through Georgia, of Sherman's army burning a path to the sea. He should have been rallying to the Confederate cause, using his military training to fight for his way of life. But he couldn't. He was paralyzed by his secret. He was afraid that if he drew attention to Oakhaven, if he brought soldiers onto his land, the rebels would carry out their threat. He was a traitor to his own cause, a coward hiding behind the walls of his decaying mansion. He received a second message in the spring. This one was more detailed. The child is a boy. He is strong. She is well. The news should have filled him with joy, but it only deepened his despair. His son, his heir, was being raised by his enemies. The Thorn bloodline was continuing, but not in the way he had envisioned. It was a perversion of everything he believed in. The war ended in 1865. The Confederacy was defeated. Slavery was abolished. The world the colonel had known was gone, swept away in a tide of blood and fire. But for Alistair Thorn, the real war was just beginning. The end of slavery should have meant the end of his nightmare. The rebels were now free men. They had no reason to hold Eleanor, no reason to keep their bargain. He waited, day after day, for her to return. He scanned the horizon, hoping to see her familiar figure walking up the drive. But she never came. He began to hear whispers in the nearby town of Mill Creek. Whispers of a community of freedmen living deep in the swamps, a place they called New Canaan. It was said they were led by a man named Kofi, a man of great wisdom and strength. It was said they lived apart from the white world, self-sufficient and fiercely independent. And it was said that among them lived a white woman, a ghost from the old plantation days, who was treated with great respect. The colonel's obsession grew. He had to see her. He had to know if his son was truly his. He had to reclaim what was his. He sold off the last of his livestock, the silver, the fine china, everything of value that remained at Oakhaven. He used the money to hire a guide, a grizzled old trapper named Jed, who knew the swamps like the back of his hand. The journey into the swamps was a descent into a primordial world. The air was thick with humidity and the drone of insects. Spanish moss hung from the cypress trees like ghostly shrouds. Jed led him through a labyrinth of waterways and hidden paths, his face grim. "Ain't no place for white folks, Colonel," he muttered. "Them people in New Canaan. They don't take kindly to visitors." After 2 days of grueling travel, they reached the edge of the settlement. It was a cluster of sturdy cabins built on stilts above the water, surrounded by carefully tended gardens and pens of livestock. It was a thriving community, a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of its people. The colonel's heart hammered in his chest. He saw children playing, women washing clothes, men working in the fields. And then he saw her. Eleanor was sitting on the porch of the largest cabin, a baby in her arms. She looked older, her face lined with a sadness that went beyond mere grief, but she also looked peaceful, strong. The baby, a boy of about a year old, had her storm-gray eyes and a shock of dark hair. He was laughing, reaching for her face. The colonel felt a surge of conflicting emotions: relief, longing, jealousy, and a deep, abiding shame. He stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel path. The community fell silent. Men stopped their work, their eyes hard and watchful. Women gathered their children close. Kofi emerged from the cabin, his expression unreadable. "Colonel Thorne," Kofi said, his voice calm, "you were told to keep silent." "I had to see her," the colonel said, his voice rough. "I had to see my son." Eleanor looked up, her eyes meeting his. There was no warmth in her gaze, no welcome, only a weary resignation. "Alistair," she said softly, "you shouldn't have come." "Eleanor, please," he pleaded, taking another step forward. "Come home. Bring the boy. We can start again. Oakhaven is yours. It's his." She shook her head, a single, decisive movement. "Oakhaven is a tomb, Alistair. A tomb of lies and blood. I will not raise my son in that place. He is not your son. Not in the way you mean. He is my son. And he is a son of New Canaan." The words struck him like a physical blow. "He is a thorn," he cried, his voice cracking. "He has my blood." "He has your blood," Kofi said, stepping between them, his presence a solid wall. "But he has our name. His name is Kofi Jr. He is a free man, raised in freedom. You have no claim on him, Colonel. Your claim ended the day you gave his mother away." The colonel looked from Kofi's impassive face to Eleanor's resolute one, and he saw the truth. He had lost them, not just to the rebels, but to a new world, a world he could never understand or be a part of. His son would grow up knowing nothing of the Thorne legacy, nothing of the grand mansion or the vast plantations. He would know only this life of freedom and community. The dynasty was truly dead. He turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped, an old man before his time. He returned to Oakhaven, a broken shell of the man he had been. He lived out his days in the decaying mansion, a ghost haunting the ruins of his own making. He never spoke of Eleanor or his son. He never tried to contact them again. He died alone in 1872, his name a forgotten footnote in the history of a region that had moved on. But the story of Oakhaven did not end with the colonel's death. Eleanor and her son, Kofi Jr., thrived in New Canaan. The community grew, becoming a beacon of black self-determination in the post-Reconstruction South. Kofi Jr. was educated, first by his mother and then by teachers from the North. He became a lawyer, a fierce advocate for civil rights, using the legal system his grandfather had helped to build to fight for the rights of his people. He never took the Thorne name, but he never denied his heritage either. He carried the blood of both the oppressor and the oppressed, a living testament to the complex, painful history of America. The mansion at Oakhaven fell into ruin, its grand columns crumbling, its halls echoing with the ghosts of the past. But the land itself was not lost. In the 1920s, Kofi Jr., now a successful attorney in Atlanta, used his savings to buy back the Oakhaven property. He didn't rebuild the mansion. Instead, he turned the land into a school for black children, a place of learning and hope built on the ashes of a plantation that had once been a symbol of bondage. He called it the Eleanor Winthrop School, in honor of his mother, the woman who had endured the unspeakable and emerged with her dignity intact. The Colonel's agreement, born of cowardice and desperation, had indeed destroyed the Thorne dynasty. But from its ashes, something new and far more enduring was born. A legacy not of oppression, but of resilience, of freedom, and of the unbreakable human spirit. The 7 slaves who had walked into the woods with the Colonel's wife had not just taken a prize. They had planted a seed. And that seed, watered by Eleanor's courage and Kofi's vision, had grown into a mighty tree, its branches offering shade and shelter to generations yet unborn. The Colonel had tried to save his bloodline by sacrificing his wife, but in doing so, he had unwittingly ensured that his bloodline would serve a purpose far greater than the hollow pride of a dead dynasty. The true legacy of Oakhaven was not written in the ledgers of a plantation, but in the hearts and minds of the free people who had risen from its shadow. And that, in the end, was a victory far sweeter than any the Colonel could have ever imagined.